Hi everyone, thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks for David for making all of this happen and getting me here safe and sound. So get right into it. So the talk is titled Crip Feelings, Feeling Crip, and it starts with two epigraphs. The first is from José Muñoz's article, Feeling Brown, Feeling Down, Latina Affect, the Performativity of Race, and the Depressive Position. Quote, describing the depressive position in relation to what I am calling brown feeling chronicles a certain ethics of the self that is utilized and deployed by people of color and other minoritarian subjects who don't feel quite right within the protocols of normative affect and comportment. And then the second comes from Robert McRuer's Crip Times, Disability, Globalization, and Resistance. Quote, Crip has the capacity to encompass forms of embodiment or states of mind that are arguably in excess of the able-minded or able-bodied disabled binary. The politics of Crip have generally been actively collective or coalitional. So the introduction with the subtitle, What If I Cried, starts with, if there is no crying in disability studies, then what becomes of those whose emotions are disabling, or those whose disabilities are invalidated because it is considered just a feeling? What if crying is the proper response to the world? Over the past 6 months, I've been part of the Conference Committee for Composing Disabilities, a biannual disability studies conference hosted by the Department of English at the George Washington University. This year's keynote was Liz Crow, a disabled artist, activist, and scholar who talked about Figures, a mass sculpture performance that makes visible the human cost of austerity and urges action against it. So a brief summary of what that is from the website. Using excavated raw river mud and taking up residence on the streets and foreshore of central London, artist-activist Liz Crow sculpted 650 small human figures, each one representing an individual at the sharp end of austerity. Coinciding with the tide times on the nearby Thames, at the incoming tide, the newly sculpted figures were moved to safety. At each low tide, the artist returned to sculpt more figures, in an endurance ritual that spanned 11 consecutive days and nights in all weathers. Though made in the same form, there they are. Though made in the same form, each figure differed in its detail, representing both common humanity and the individual. Their number echoed the 650 constituencies throughout which the effects of austerity are felt, as well as the number of MPs whose choices determine the choices of others. One stride, the figures toured en masse in a mobile exhibition that visited locations from London to Bristol over 5 days. The figures making visible the stark human cost of austerity and creating a talking point for members of the public to grapple with the questions raised by the work. The 650 stories of people at the sharp end of austerity are drawn from leading-edge research, parliamentary records, and campaigns in the field of social justice, covering a range of topics including benefits reform, local authority spending, homelessness, malnutrition, NHS rationing, and so on. They've been selected to represent a spectrum of experience. Volunteer stewards from campaigning and arts curatorial backgrounds attended the performance, drawing on these stories and supporting members of the public in conversation about the issue raised by the work. Timed to coincide with the 2015 general election and subsequent newly formed government, Figures raises profound questions about how we treat each other, what kind of society we want to be, and what role we might each of us have in bringing it about. On the day of the keynote, we learned that Liz had lost her voice, and her assistant Jess would be reading a paper for her so that Liz could save her voice for the Q&A. Towards the middle of the keynote, while reading a short narrative of the impact of austerity on disabled people in the UK, Jess began to cry and was unable to continue reading. A startling number of narratives, all of which are available on the website for Figures, involve people with psychiatric disabilities such as depression and schizophrenia. And as I clicked through the different narratives, the number of instances of suicide were shocking. Quote, 36-year-old Martin was assessed as fit for work. He had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but with the support of mental health services, was managing to stay off drugs and to live independently with a strong group of friends. His mother says the prospect of having to take a job before he felt ready had piled on pressure. 2 months after his assessment, he left a note saying, "To those I love, I'm sorry, goodbye." Jess's crying seemed the appropriate response as she read that narrative. But, as Elizabeth Donaldson and Catherine Prendergast note, crying during a conference presentation is in one respect a failure to regulate the emotions. What if, in line with Donaldson and Prendergast's further elaboration on the power of crying as transgression, we change the framing around appropriate responses? Rather than try to think of the proper comportment and responses that are demanded of us, we might think through how to create a world that can accommodate and embrace the many ways people act, express themselves, and move through the world. I position the crying as a type of protest, a continuation of figures, and proof of witnessing the violence that results from disability being defined by companies aiming to maximize profits and execute austerity measures. This paper takes up Donaldson and Prendergast's idea that, quote, there's a certain power in transgression. Abject bodies and abject emotions can reveal the fault lines of the foundational concepts of what the body should be or should do. In line with Robert McRuer's ability trouble, this paper dwells in the trouble with bodily comportment in the wake of affect. We might, and I am calling this, affect trouble. The trouble of always being at risk of not expressing proper affect or not feeling properly. The constant pressure to regulate affect and perform, which is to say emote, properly. The idea that, like gender and ability trouble, there is an ideal way of feeling that regulates and controls while also remaining an impossible thing to achieve. Affect trouble is predicated on the failure to control your feelings or emotions, and through failure there is the impetus to always do better. When Jess cried, there was a silence, but the emotional habitus, a term coined by Deborah Gould to describe the emotional environment amongst a group of people, of the large lecture hall was not pity, shock, or confusion, but of understanding and empathy. People in the audience may have also lost, or almost lost, control of their body, despite any rules of professionalism in academic spaces that may have demanded a particular way of being in the audience. And while there was silence, there was also Liz slowly reaching over to touch Jess's leg to comfort her. This moment of silence and tears is and also comes from a complicated interweaving of disability and emotion. There are disabilities in the figure narratives, both physical and psychiatric, that are being disregarded as just emotions, not severe enough, or not disabling at all, to devastating and deadly consequences. These narratives are collected and made part of figures, which is inundated and layered with disability. Jess was part of the team that carried Liz down to the riverbank and now reads when Liz is unable. On stage, Jess becomes unable to continue reading the stories of disability in the place of Liz because of her emotional response. Through it all, there is the reaching. The reaching is a bridge in response to the slippage between and confluence of disability and emotions. The reach disrupts the notion that Jess's failure to regulate or control her emotions was inappropriate. It cosigns the emoting, the crying, the inability to continue reading as valid, appropriate, and maybe necessary. This paper takes this reaching as a starting point and thinks through psychiatric disability, queerness, and affect in an effort to disrupt disciplines and identity. Building on Robert McRuer's work connecting queerness and disability, and José Muñoz's theorization of brown feelings, the affective position inhabited by people of color, I name the slipperiness between identity and emotions as Crip feelings, feeling Crip. The term uses Crip twofold. First, it signifies the confluence of disability and emotions, further troubles the able-disabled identity divide, and expands on Robert McRuer's ability trouble to not only allow understandings of emotion to be put into crisis, but also proliferate opportunities for political alliances. The goal here is not to sketch out the opportunities or alliances themselves, but to begin to theorize and explore the crisis created by overlapping between disability and emotion. Second, Crip points to the ways in which, in the words of McRuer, quote, Crip often has the fabulous potential to be simultaneously flamboyantly identitarian, as in, we are Crip and you will acknowledge that, and flamboyantly anti-identitarian, as in, we reject your categories or the capacity of language saturated in ableism to describe us. My aim with this paper is to explore the anti-identitarian components of Crip that align with José Muñoz's call for affect, not as a placeholder, but something altogether different from identity. The feeling in Crip Feelings, Feeling Crip, points towards the Muñozian feeling as a means of coalition building through shared positions and critique, but also indexes the way that Crip can be a position from which certain feelings follow, or an affect unto itself. Feeling, to quote Cvetkovich, does a particular kind of work. It names the undifferentiated stuff of feeling, spans the distinction between emotion and affect central to some theories, acknowledges the somatic and sensory nature of feelings as experiences that aren't just cognitive conceptions or constructions, end quote. Amongst disability and affect in this paper is queerness. McRuer often relates and defines queer and Crip as having similar abilities, to both build coalition because of identity while also refuse discrete categories. Alongside Muñoz's brown feelings, we may also think of Lee Edelman's No Future, where he defines queerness as that which, quote, can never define an identity, it can only ever disturb one, end quote. While I'm skeptical and critical of the work of No Future, and don't wish this paper to be aligned with the anti-relational turn in queer theory, I believe this understanding of queerness as able to disrupt identity is a useful way to think through this triad of disability, queerness, and affect. If all three can define and undo categories, then the confluence of them all may prove valuable. The ways they undo, disrupt, disturb, and question one another fuels my desire to attend to the slippage in confluences and makes the term Crip Feelings, Feeling Crip a needed meditation. To think through this term, I turn to three objects. The first two, Cvetkovich's book, Depression, A Public Feeling, and José Muñoz's chapter, Jeté Out the Window, From Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer futurity, offers the opportunity to examine the often overlooked imbrication between emotions and disability in queer and affect theory. In both, affect and queerness are named, and central to the argument, what's potentially under-addressed is the ways that both are entangled with disability. I look to this pair of secondary theoretical texts as primary objects because of the way they talk through and around disability and affect, but never name the ways that disability and affect are potentially two words for the same thing. While Cvetkovich specifically names depression as the focus, Muñoz's description of Fred Herco, who's the subject of the chapter, could alternatively thought of as mania, addiction, or at least a lack of proper normative bodily comportment and control that often coincides with descriptions and experiences of disability. My desire here is not to point to the holes in either of the works or perform a type of paranoid reading that uncovers the problems with either. The absence of these terms says and does something, so while I want to expand and continue, I also want to think through the absence. I want to see what can be made possible when disability, cripness, and maybe madness are brought in and named. For the sake of time, I'll give an abridged reading of this pair, but we'll be happy to come back during the Q&A. I then turn the last section to the character Evan from the third series of the popular Norwegian television show Skam, who is both queer and bipolar. A major component of the narrative arc of the season is the way it becomes known that he's bipolar, and the way it complicates his budding relationship with the protagonist of the season, Isak. While the choice to pick Evan is in small part because of how compelling I find the portrayal, I largely want to think through Crip Feelings, Feeling Crip, through a queer bipolar character because of the ways mania, depression, and queerness intersect and echo Cvetkovich and Muñoz's work, and the ways they elucidate affect trouble. These terms brush up against each other through more mainstream studies, theoretical work, and ethnographic work. Depression and queerness usually gain attention when studies show how many queer people, especially queer youth, are depressed or at risk of depression. Queerness, mania, and depression are all considered and defined in terms of excess to the norm. That queerness is considered excessive or in excess through different forms or excess is an overlapping concept between different camps of queer theory that are thought of as opposed to one another, anti-relational and relational, namely Edelman and Muñoz respectively. In Depression, Cvetkovich spends a portion of her introduction sketching out the affective turn and the different ways that queer theory has long been informed by affect. Emily Martin's Bipolar Expedition, an ethnographic work on bipolar disorder in the United States, attends to the ways rationality and normalizing power, a topic that queer and Crip theory are deeply interested in, impact and inform understandings of bipolar disorder, along with those who are bipolar, alongside some historicizing of bipolar disorder in relation to mood disorders and the history of non-normative affect. Deborah Gould's Moving Politics attends to the ways affect and emotion are key ways of understanding the trajectory of the AIDS crisis in the United States. And focusing on a queer bipolar character, I want to weave together these different overlapping understandings of queer, disability, and affect together. So section 1, a loving critique of queer affect. My approach to working through Cvetkovich's depression and Muñoz's Jeté is to think of the ways disability, queerness, and affect can unravel one another, yielding the slipperiness I evoked earlier, when an object or reading of an object has to grapple with all three. My aim is to do a loving critique, a term I pulled from Jennifer Christine Nash's Black Body and Ecstasy, that names a critique that does not abandon the field for shortcomings, but rather attends with care to the field and contributes to its continuation. This critique opens up some possibilities that I'll begin to work through in this section, and then the one that follows that focuses on Evan specifically. Hopefully in working through one text that is explicitly about depression and another that could be about mania, will help piece together a Crip, queer, affective approach to manic depression. And Cvetkovich's Depression, a Public Feeling, holds potential for so much, but for the sake of time and the specificity of this paper, I want to focus on the introduction where she introduces the term political depression and defines it as the sense that customary forms of political response, including direct action and critical analysis, are no longer working either to change the world or to make us feel better. Political depression combines an attention to the ways the varied forms of oppression can cause depression, but also enables a critical attention and lens through which to view depression that may be more biological or the result of a particular stressor. Cvetkovich pushes for a type of reparative reading of depression. Rather than desire to uncover the root cause or find a cure, she wants the reader to think of what is to be gained from depression. What is being depressed and able that would not be possible otherwise? When discussing an event held by the Public Feelings Project, a field tank, riffing on think tank, she explains that, quote, the goal of the event is to depathologize negative feelings so they can be seen as possible resources for political action rather than its antithesis. This is not, however, to suggest that depression is thereby converted into a positive experience. It retains its association with inertia and despair, if not apathy and indifference. But these feelings, moods, and sensibilities become sites of publicity and comment and community formation. In many ways, this echoes Robert McRuer and Mary Lisa Johnson's Cripistemology, Crip ways of knowing, and Crip knowledge is knowledge production. Cvetkovich seems to align with the social, or to think with Alison Kafer's term, political model. Political model and political depression could be sister terms that do similar work in the ways they demand for more than what currently exists or is offered. Cvetkovich specifically places pills alongside revolution regime change, noting that revolution regime change might be more in line with the political analysis of depression. The might gives way to the possibility that pills alone might not be enough, that medication might help, but it asks of us to think towards the root. Pills may manage depression and provide much-needed help, but what about the world around us and the ways it excises those experiencing depression, literally via austerity that's explored in Liz Crow's project? And what are the accommodations, and what would a regime change, maybe alongside an ever-improving medical regimen, prove more effective than pills alone? Working through the effects of different type of pills, amphetamines, José Muñoz's Jeté Out the Window, Fred Herco's Incandescent Illumination thinks through the ways that Herco, a choreographer and dancer with the Judson Memorial Church and other countercultural productions in New York, produced surplus that couldn't be reduced or contained in terms of capitalist understandings of profit maximization. In the chapter, Muñoz describes Herco in terms that could be aligned with what Robert McRuer thinks of Crip. While Herco may not have been disabled, or at least named as disabled in Muñoz's chapter, it is clear that the work Muñoz is doing is Crip work. queer time and Crip time both exist in contradistinction with straight time. On a quotidian level, such as Herco being too fast, possibly manic, and too slow, while also stuttering and twitching along the way, but also on a larger scale, in the ways reproductive futurity and generational time becomes disrupted, or, in the case of Herco, there's a break from life expectancy, the length someone is expected to live through suicide. Here are a couple quotes to kind of give some examples of how Muñoz talks about Fred Herco. How can someone on amphetamines be slow? Drug use and queer desires led to Herco's experiencing the world differently. Certainly, by the criteria of straight time, a junkie is a failure. Drugs are a surplus that pushes one off course. No longer able to contribute labor at the proper tempo, here, again, surplus is not simply an additive, it distorts, a stuttering particularity that shoves one off course, out of straight time. Herco's movement through the world in the performance space was always disruptive, always linked to the force of failure, the aesthetics of excess with minimalism, temporal disjointedness, madness, and utopian surplus. But in this screen test, our eyes should not be content to see a drugged-out homosexual who made some underground films and danced at Judson. What I see in this film is the artist and all his embodied cultural surplus, twitching and moving in the ways that tell us that this time and place is not enough. Herco enacts a critical impatience with the present, a dissatisfaction with the here and now. Furthermore, I see desire. Herco cruises the camera and the spectator. He flirts with it, not able to sit down, wanting to display himself beyond the limits of Warhol's portraiture. Muñoz, thinking of Herco in terms of surplus value and queerness, but what if disability were to enter the discussion more explicitly, then how might Herco be recoded or coded differently? Twitching, drug use, stuttering steps, flamboyant dancing are all positioned as excess in line with Herco's queerness, as if these things are the result of it. Muñoz's mobilization of straight time may be thought of as able-bodied time as well, and Herco's queerness could just be part of the reason for his behavior. Thinking of Herco as a Crip queer figure maintains and even reaffirms many of Muñoz's assertions about the way that Herco does not fit into the work, both temporally and spatially, but it also calls into question the way that queerness and non-normative bodily comportment aren't so easily aligned. Herco is interpolated into queerness and a utopian hermeneutic, while he also exceeds those classifications. While this may aid Muñoz, it also calls into question the categories that can be used to describe Herco. Queerness, a thing that can both construct and undo, becomes undone as a category when Crip and affect are added, but, like Muñoz's description of Herco's surplus in relation to drug use, added doesn't only mean additive, but the additional categories distort as much as they contribute and expand. Crip queer feelings emerge from this distortion. Section 2. At the same time in a different place in the universe. Skam, a popular Norwegian television show set at a high school, follows the academic year of a different character each season. In season 3, the show focuses on Isak, and early on gives hints that he may not be exactly straight, ranging from the introduction of a new boy in school, Evan, who seems to always catch Isak looking at him, to Isak's general disinterest in the girls at school. After a series of seemingly unlikely events result in Isak joining an after-school club related to theater called Kusagrupa, he finds himself at the first meeting. Shortly after sitting down, Isak sees Evan walk in, and they make eye contact yet again. When the meeting starts with a group activity, Isak, clearly disinterested, leaves to go to the bathroom to play games on his phone, and as soon thereafter he finds himself bumping into Evan as he tries to leave the bathroom. Yeah, so there's a picture of them. When the meeting, here we go. Isak appears enamored with Evan, as Evan tells him to come out to smoke a joint. While outside, Emma, a girl that Isak had met before at a party, approaches them and asks Isak to be paired with her for activities. Isak does not know a way to say no, and seeing Isak struggle, Evan says to Isak that he thought they were already a pair. From here out, the series revolves around Isak and Evan running into each other on the bus by happenstance or seeing each other at the parties held by Cosa Grupa, and as they run into one another, they grow closer and closer. Not even Evan's girlfriend prevents them from eventually dating. In the 8 of 10 episodes of the season, Evan tells Isak that he has gotten them a suite in a hotel room for the night. They end up seemingly naked on the floor, wrapped in bedding, eating room service, when Evan begins explaining his grandiose plans for them to get married. Isak begins to worry why Evan is acting this way, but does not address it, even as Evan continues to act off when they're in bed together later. Twice in the middle of the night, Evan wakes Isak up. The second time, he's walking around the suite naked and tells Isak he's leaving to get McDonald's. Isak then sees Evan leaving the suite, and by the time Isak can get dressed and follow Evan, he's too far behind. Isak, worried about Evan's safety, as Evan is out in the streets in the middle of the night naked, calls Evan's ex-girlfriend Sonia for help. Sonia gets there and explains to Isak what is happening and what has been happening to Evan. She angrily tells Isak he's manic. That's what's happening now. He's not well. Do you think he's in love with you? He's not. It's just a sick idea he's got right now. Last year he memorized the Quran in Arabic because at the time he thought it was a good idea. He's also not supposed to smoke because that's not good for him, as you might understand. So can you please just stay away? Sonia's explanation works on multiple levels. She names Evan's mania as currently happening, not something that had happened or is already over, but that could be over in the future. She asserts that Evan's love is the result of mania, the emotional state produces false emotions, and equates Evan's homosexuality and relationship with Isak with the latest of a sick idea that Evan thinks is a good idea only because he's experiencing a manic episode. In the next episode, after days of Evan texting Isak to no avail, Isak joins his friends at lunch during school and begins to explain what happened with Evan with his friends. Isak tells them Evan lost it, and that Evan is bipolar, to which one friend, Magnus, who only hears the ending, responds, "My mom's also bipolar." It is in Magnus's explanation of bipolar disorder and sharing his experience with his mom that we get the counter to Sonia. Magnus notes that Isak and Evan have been together for a while, much longer than any manic episode would have lasted. He even finds Evan leaving the hotel naked to be funny. Isak and Evan have been together through full cycles of mania and depression, so Magnus asserts that Sonia cannot be right. Evan's homosexuality does not come from mania. Further, he points out that taking Sonia's word for it completely removes Evan from the decision-making process and devalues his ability to evaluate and express his current mental state. Magnus serves as the vehicle through which the show can detach queerness from psychiatric disability while destigmatizing bipolar disorder and affirming Evan's sexual identity. This detaching allows each to exist so that a particular affective state doesn't act as proof of the validity of emotions. Both can exist in tension and harmony. Disability and emotions are allowed to be more complicated and not conditional on one another to serve a particular end. Magnus offers the counter to Sonia's allegiance to a juridical way of knowing and controlling people perceived to be mad that can be thought of in line with ideologies that pathologize psychiatric disorders. Rather than rely on experts, Magnus tells Isak, "What about asking Evan how he feels?" In centering Evan's feelings, both emotional and mental, not as an object of discussion, Magnus allows for disability and queerness to exist together in ways that resist and challenge Sonia's impulse to enforce compulsory hetero-able-bodiedness. All done in the culturally important public space of the lunch table. Magnus allows the show to juxtapose different ways of knowing and being disabled and queer as they relate to affect. This pivotal moment in the show adds Evan and Isak to existing formations of, in the words of Robert McRuer, quote, "severely disabled, critically queer bodies," end quote, that, quote, "have already generated ability trouble that remaps the public sphere and reimagines and reshapes the limited forms of embodiment and desire proliferated by the system that would contain us all," end quote. To push this work further, I want to expand on Magnus's assertion about the timeline of mania and Isak and Evan's relationship. While Magnus accurately explains that Evan has not been manic the entire time, as the season goes on, Evan begins having larger swings that have him increasingly manic or depressed for longer periods of time. Even in the first scene, when Isak and Evan meet in the bathroom, Evan is smoking, which exacerbates his bipolar disorder. Even at this early moment in the season, Evan has signs of mania. His smile is excessive and boldly tells Isak to come with him and go outside without checking to see if Isak actually follows his command. Towards the middle of the season, before Isak and Evan begin dating, they both meet up at Isak's home with their girlfriends to drink and go to the school dance together. When Sonia and Isak's date go to the bathroom together, Evan, in a moment we can in hindsight understand as part of a manic episode, tells Isak that they are leaving. As they are biking, Evan has them stop and sneak into someone's home who Evan claims to know, a lie, to swim in their pool. During the most potentially manic episode up to this point in the season is when we get Isak and Evan's first kiss, with Evan initiating. Mania spurs this event that leads to Isak and Evan kissing, and the next day officially being together as a couple. As they lay in Isak's bed all day, avoiding leaving or dealing with repercussions of their actions and smoking weed, they talk about life, and while Evan is interested in linearity and the ability to direct, Isak is interested in infinity. Infinity here meaning an infinite number of parallel universes, happening at the same time with an infinite number of small differences. Throughout the season, Evan focuses on Isak not only when he's manic, such as the day and subsequent night in the hotel suite, but also when he is depressed. A number of times when Evan's depression prevents him from going to school or being engaged in his surroundings, he finds ways of reaching out to Isak, from showing up at school just to see Isak for a few minutes in private, or slipping notes to Isak in his jacket or locker. Evan's antisocial moods actually heighten his interest in Isak through antisocial modes of communicating. When they briefly break up, it is in a depressive state where Evan finds ways to win Isak back through his notes. Even as depression prevents him from entering a public space and attending school, he finds different ways of communicating with Isak. Even, maybe as an apology, puts his notes in terms of different universes. Each note has a drawing that shows how things currently are with the box around them. So in this one, it's Isak eating alone, and on the one on the right, it's the two of them eating together, and the caption at the top, at the same time in a different place in the universe, which is like a literal translation, and probably more accurate one is the same at a different place in a different universe. Because of because of his depression and his feelings for Isak, Evan creates another universe where they're able, where they're together, such as this one, or where Evan texts Isak back. And Cvetkovich may call this universe making as a, quote, new form of sociality, end quote, that comes about because of a different and negative affect, that calls on new social formations as both survival tactics and ways of flourishing in a potentially hostile or overwhelming world. What if Evan's queerness and his different mental states were unable to be disentangled as Magnus offers? When he's experiencing depression, he creates a universe where he can be with Isak, and when he's manic, he goes against what some may call reason to be with Isak. In asking the question, I don't mean to agree with Sonia that Evan's homosexuality is a sick idea, or that Evan should desire to minimize his manic and depressive episodes to eliminate homosexuality and give in to compulsory able-bodiedness. In detaching queerness and disability, Scum affirms that a person could be disabled and just happen to be queer, or vice versa. But in that affirmation, disability and queerness are necessarily kept distinct and insular. I posit a third way of understanding Evan's multiple emotional states that comes through Robert McRuer's reading of Bob Flanagan, a way for queerness, disability, and affect to be entangled and slippery. When Bob Flanagan was asked, what do you think of the juxtaposition of metaphors, being sick equals sadomasochism? Flanagan did not disavow disability or his non-normative sexual desires, but embraced and disidentified with the premise of the question, that maybe the two are at some level equal after all. McRuer reads Flanagan's answer as ultimately asking why or whether it matters that the two, in Flanagan's case, sick and SM, but maybe in Evan's case, this be read as manic depressive and queer, should be disentangled from one another at all. What if, like Flanagan, the messy entanglement of disability and queer embodied, the entanglement of queerness and disability embodied in Evan can serve as an example of, quote, the seemingly incomprehensible way to survive and survive well, when surviving well can paradoxically mean surviving sick, end quote. That's from McRuer, Crip Theory. For Isak and Evan, the overlapping of queerness and disability and the emotions that arise are not discrete things to be kept at a distance from one another. They're just how things are. When Evan and Isak get back together after Evan's manic episode, with a certain reconciling with that, Evan stays with Isak for a bit. And when he enters a depressive mood, Isak knows how to handle it and offers advice to those around Evan. There isn't stigma, just understanding about what is happening and how to best care for him. The season ends with a break from Muñoz's understanding of straight time by Isak and Evan, unconcerned about the future and the pressures that are often associated with it. Their attention is to the now, because queerness and disability are uncertain places, and all that's guaranteed is what's before them now. So the conclusion, which is titled, So What Happens? If there's no crying in disability studies, then what becomes of those whose emotions are disabling, or those whose disability is invalidated because it is considered just a feeling? For those at the sharp end of austerity, what happens can and too often is devastating. They fall through the cracks that Crip feelings, feeling Crip, aims to elucidate. We may not be able to prevent it from being slippery or confusing, but we can know that the confluence of disability and emotions isn't an additive situation. It's confusing, complicated, and at times deadly. In Scam, the lines between queerness, emotion, and mania are all blurred. So what becomes of Evan? Unlike many of the stories that are told in Figures, he doesn't die. He finds queer love, gets hospitalized, creates different universes. He embodies Crip feelings, feeling Crip. So while the confluence can be deadly, it can, when better understood, even if it's just an understanding of an inability to know, be an opportunity to imagine and live and create better worlds together. Thank you.